The wind had a particular way of speaking across the Nebraska plains in late autumn. It whispered through the dried grass, rattled the loose boards of the barn, and carried with it the scent of coming winter. Samuel Hayes stood on his porch, coffee cup warming his calloused hands, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge. The steam from his cup disappeared into the cold morning air, just as everything seemed to eventually disappear in this vast, empty land. He'd been alone for 3 years now, 3 years since the fever took Martha and their boy, leaving him with 40 acres of stubborn soil, a dozen head of cattle, and a silence so complete it sometimes felt like drowning. The house still held their ghosts, Martha's apron hanging on the kitchen hook, untouched, little Thomas's wooden horse sitting on the mantel, gathering dust like a relic from another life. Samuel drained his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. The cattle needed checking. The fence along the north pasture had been worrying him for days, leaning under the weight of time and weather. He pulled on his worn leather coat. The one Martha had mended so many times the original fabric was more memory than material, and headed toward the barn. His horse, a bay mare named Buttercup, despite her stubborn temperament, nickered softly as he approached. Samuel had bought her the spring before Martha died, back when he still believed in naming things hopefully. Now she was just another creature sharing his solitude, though he appreciated her steady presence more than he'd ever admit aloud. The morning routine was sacred in its simplicity. Feed the horses, check the water trough, inspect the chickens, counting to make sure the fox hadn't been bold in the night. These tasks anchored him to the world, gave shape to days that might otherwise bleed together into one long, gray existence. As he worked, Samuel's mind wandered to town. He needed supplies, flour, salt, maybe some nails for that fence. The thought of human interaction made him weary. The folks in Willow Creek meant well, but their pitying looks and careful conversation reminded him too sharply of what he'd lost. Widow Harrison had been particularly persistent lately, bringing pies and making eyes at him like he was a prize bull at auction. He appreciated the pies more than the attention. By mid-morning, he'd saddled Buttercup and started the ride to check the north fence. The land stretched endlessly before him, brown and gold under the pale autumn sky. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the quiet. Samuel had always loved this country, even when it seemed determined to break him. There was honesty in its harshness, a brutal beauty that demanded respect. The fence was worse than he'd thought. 2 posts had rotted through at the base, and a section of wire sagged dangerously low. If the cattle found it, they'd be scattered across 3 counties by sunset. Samuel dismounted, tying Buttercup to a sturdy post, and fetched his tools from the saddlebags. The work was hard and familiar, the kind that left a man's muscles aching and his mind mercifully empty. He was wrestling with a particularly stubborn post when he noticed the smoke, just a thin column rising from the woods to the west, barely visible against the gray sky. Samuel paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. Those woods bordered his property and the abandoned Mackenzie place. Nobody had lived there for 5 years. Not since old man Mackenzie died and his kin back east sold the land to speculators who never showed. The smoke troubled him. Drifters sometimes used abandoned buildings for shelter, and while most were harmless, some brought trouble. Samuel had enough ghosts without adding more. He secured the fence as best he could it would hold for now, and mounted Buttercup, turning her toward the woods. The trees grew thicker as he rode west, cottonwoods and willows clustering along the dry creek bed. The smoke smell grew stronger, mixed with something else, the sharp scent of pine resin. Someone was burning green wood, the mark of inexperience or desperation. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, though he didn't draw it. He'd learned long ago that fear and haste made poor companions. The Mackenzie cabin sat in a small clearing, its roof half collapsed and walls weathered silver gray. But smoke indeed rose from the chimney, and Samuel could see someone had patched the worst holes with canvas and scrap wood. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing, considering his options. The law gave him no authority here. This wasn't his land. But neighbors looked out for each other in this country, even absent ones. A figure emerged from behind the cabin, and Samuel's hand tightened on Buttercup's reins. But it was just a child, a boy, maybe 6 or 7, carrying an armload of kindling that seemed almost bigger than he was. The child saw Samuel and froze, sticks tumbling from his arms. They stared at each other across the clearing, the boy's eyes wide with fear that made Samuel's chest ache with unwanted memory. "It's all right," Samuel called, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm not here to cause trouble." The boy didn't move, didn't speak. His clothes were patched and too thin for the season, his feet wrapped in rags instead of proper boots. Samuel had seen that kind of poverty before, the kind that carved itself into a child's face and left them old before their time. "Is your ma or PA about?" Samuel asked. The boy's mouth opened, closed. Then he turned and ran toward the cabin, stumbling over the dropped kindling. Samuel waited, patient as he'd learned to be with spooked cattle and wounded creatures. The sun climbed higher, casting short shadows across the clearing. Buttercup shifted restlessly, eager to be moving or grazing, but Samuel held her steady. When the cabin door opened again, it revealed a woman. She stood in the doorway like she was guarding it, one hand gripping the frame, the other hidden in the folds of her skirt where Samuel suspected she held a knife or pistol. Her dress had been blue once. Maybe. But sun and washing had faded it to the color of winter sky. Her hair, dark with streaks of early gray, was pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty if it weren't so marked by hardship. "This is private property," she said. Her voice was steady, but Samuel heard the fear underneath, carefully controlled. "Yes, ma'am, I know it." Samuel replied, "I'm Samuel Hayes. I own the land east of here. Saw your smoke and thought I should check. We're not causing any harm." The words came quick, defensive, just passing through. Samuel nodded slowly. "Coming on winter to be passing through, that roof won't hold much snow." Her chin lifted slightly. "We'll manage." They stood there, measuring each other across the clearing. Samuel noticed things the way she kept the boy behind her, protective, the tremor in her hand despite her brave words, the pile of green wood that would smoke more than burn. He thought of the coming cold, the fence that needed fixing, the empty rooms in his house. "You know how to season wood properly?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise her. We're making do." "Green wood like that'll smoke you out before it warms you. There's a dead oak about a quarter-mile north. Lightning struck it last summer. Good, dry wood if you've got an axe." She stared at him, suspicion warring with need in her expression. "Why would you tell me that?" Samuel shrugged. "Neighbors help neighbors. That's how it works out here." "We're not neighbors. We're nothing to you." The words hung in the air between them. Samuel thought of Martha, how she would have already been off Buttercup and halfway to the cabin with a basket of food and practical advice. But Martha had been the one with the gift for people. Samuel only knew cattle and weather and the lonely arithmetic of survival. "Maybe not," he said finally. "But that boy's going to need warmer clothes come December. And that roof won't last the first real storm." Her knuckles whitened where she gripped the door frame. Pride and desperation played across her features like cloud shadows on the plains. Samuel recognized the look he'd worn it himself those first months after the funeral, when neighbors tried to help and he'd been too raw to accept it. "We don't need charity," she said. "Didn't offer any," Samuel replied. He gathered Buttercup's reins, preparing to leave. "Just information. What you do with it is your business." He was mounting his horse when she spoke again, softer this time. "The oak quarter-mile north. You said—" Samuel nodded without turning. "Lightning struck. Can't miss it." He rode away without looking back, but he felt their eyes on him until the trees swallowed the clearing. His mind was already calculating how much flour he had stored, whether his old coat might fit the boy with the sleeves rolled up. How many days before the first hard freeze? It was dangerous. this sudden caring. He'd built his walls carefully these 3 years, brick by brick of daily routine and deliberate solitude. But the boy's eyes stayed with him, that familiar mixture of fear and desperate hope, and the woman's pride, fierce as a mother wolf's, even as poverty gnawed at her heels. Samuel knew he'd be back. Not tomorrow, that would seem like pressure. But soon, with information. Nothing more. Where to find the best fishing spots along the creek. Which plants made good eating. Small offerings that weren't quite charity, that left room for dignity. The sun was high when he reached his fence line again. The repair had held, but it needed proper fixing. Everything needed proper fixing. It seemed fences, roofs, lives. Samuel dismounted and got back to work, but his hands moved automatically while his mind wandered west, to smoke rising from a broken chimney and a boy gathering kindling in the cold. 3 days passed before Samuel returned to the woods. He told himself he was checking his fence line, but the sack of provisions tied to his saddle suggested otherwise. The morning was crisp, frost silvering the grass, and his breath came in white puffs as he rode. He'd included practical things, salt pork, dried beans, a handful of potatoes from his root cellar. Nothing that could be called charity, just supplies a person might share with anyone passing through. The woods were quieter today. The birds already fled south or hidden deep in their winter roosts. Samuel dismounted at the same spot as before, but this time he'd heard the steady thwack of an axe biting wood. Following the sound, he found them at the lightning-struck oak he'd mentioned. The woman swung the axe with more determination than skill, while the boy gathered chips and small branches into a pile. She sensed him before she saw him, spinning around with the axe still raised. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that might have been relief or resignation. She lowered the axe slowly, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. Her hands were already blistered. Samuel noticed, probably had been since the first day. "Mr. Hayes," she said, neither welcoming nor hostile. "Ma'am." Samuel touched his hat brim. "That's hard work for hands not used to it." Her jaw tightened. "My hands have known work." "I don't doubt it." He dismounted, moving slowly, keeping his intentions clear. "Different kind of work, though. May I—" He gestured toward the axe. She hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him to approach. Samuel picked up a piece of oak, examining the grain. "See how it runs diagonal here, strike with the grain, not against it. Takes half the effort." He demonstrated, the axe falling in a smooth arc, the wood splitting clean. The boy crept closer, watching with the intense focus children reserved for things that might matter to their survival. Samuel split several more pieces, then offered the axe back to the woman. "You try." She took it, attempting to mirror his motion. Better, though her form still needed work. Samuel didn't correct her again. Too much teaching felt like condescension. Instead, he began stacking the split wood, a task that required no discussion. "I'm Grace," she said suddenly, still swinging the axe. "Grace Morrison. This is my son, Henry." Samuel nodded. "Pleased to know you, Mrs. Morrison. Henry?" The boy ducked behind his mother at the sound of his name. That's a good, strong name. Knew a Henry once. Best horse trainer in 3 counties. The boy peeked out, curious despite himself. Grace kept working, but Samuel saw her shoulders relax slightly. Names were important out here. They made you real. Gave you substance in a land that could swallow people whole. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the pile of split wood growing. When Grace paused to rest, Samuel untied the sack from his saddle. "Brought some supplies you might trade for. I'm short on help with my fence work. Thought maybe we could come to an arrangement." Grace's eyes narrowed. "What kind of arrangement?" "Fair work for fair wages. Few hours of fence mending. I pay in supplies. Market rates." "You don't need help," she said flatly. "I saw your fence. It's solid." "Winter's coming. Always more work than hands." Samuel kept his tone neutral. Unless you're not planning to stay long enough to make it worthwhile. She set down the axe, studying him. Grace Morrison had the kind of face that had learned to read men's intentions the hard way. Whatever she saw in Samuel seemed to satisfy her, at least partially. "We might be staying a while," she admitted. "Until spring, maybe. That cabin won't see you through winter as it stands." "I know." The words came sharp, defensive, then softer. "I know." Samuel considered his next words carefully. "I've got salvage lumber from my barn renovation. Been meaning to haul it away, but if someone could use it—" "Stop!" Grace held up a hand. "Just stop. I know what you're doing. Do you see a woman and child in trouble, and you want to help. It's kind, but kindness comes with expectations out here. Mr. Hayes, I've learned that the hard way." Samuel met her gaze steadily. "I lost my wife and son 3 years ago. Fever took them. Every kindness my neighbors showed me felt like salt in the wound. But it kept me alive when I didn't much want to be. I'm not looking for anything from you, Mrs. Morrison, just paying forward what was given to me." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind in the bare branches. Henry had emerged from behind his mother, drawn by something in Samuel's voice. Children knew honest grief when they heard it. "Your boy," Grace said finally. "How old?" "4, same age as Henry looks to be now." "6, Henry corrected, speaking for the first time. His voice was small but clear. "I'm 6. Big for 6, Samuel said seriously. "Bet you're a good help to your ma." The boy nodded solemnly. Grace's hand found his shoulder, protective and gentle. "He is best help I could ask for." Samuel cleared his throat. "Well, that lumber's just rotting in my barn. If you wanted to take a look, see what might be useful. No obligations." Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful. If we were to make an arrangement, work for supplies, it would be straight business. Nothing more." "Nothing more," Samuel agreed. "And I'd work alongside you, not women's work, real work. Whatever needs doing." "I'd expect nothing less." She nodded slowly. "Then we might take a look at that lumber." Samuel felt something ease in his chest. A knot he hadn't known was there. "I'll bring the wagon tomorrow. Easier to load what you need." "We'll be here." He prepared to leave, then remembered. "Mrs. Morrison, when you're splitting wood, keep your feet wider. Better balance, less strain on your back." A smile ghosted across her face, there and gone. "Thank you." Samuel mounted Buttercup, turning for home. As he reached the edge of the clearing, Henry's voice called out, "Mister, what was your boy's name?" Samuel paused. The question hurt, but it was a clean hurt, like cold air on a wound. "Thomas. His name was Thomas." "That's a good name, too," Henry said seriously. "Yes," Samuel agreed. "It was." He rode home through the gathering dusk, plans forming in his mind. Which lumber was best, what tools they'd need, how to maintain the fiction of fair trade when what they needed far outweighed what labor they could provide. But these were solvable problems, the kind that gave a man purpose. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Samuel cleared Martha's place at the dinner table. Not because he expected company, it was too soon for that, but because the empty chair no longer felt like an accusation. It was just empty, waiting to be filled or not, as life determined. He thought of Grace Morrison's blistered hands and fierce pride, of Henry's small voice saying his age like it mattered. Tomorrow he'd load the wagon with lumber and tools. Maybe throw in an extra blanket or 2 payment in advance for future work, he'd say. Nothing that could be called charity. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with promise of the season's first real storm. Samuel added another log to the fire and settled in to mend harness leather, his hands steady and sure. There was work to be done, and for the first time in years, the thought didn't weary him. In the morning, He'd take the wagon west. They'd load lumber and pretend it was just business. Nothing more, but Samuel knew better. He'd felt it in that moment of recognition, when Grace Morrison had stopped being a stranger and become a neighbor. It was terrifying and necessary, this careful stepping back into the world of human connection. "You don't have to do that anymore," he'd tell her eventually, when trust had built strong enough to bear the weight. Not yet, she wasn't ready to hear it. And perhaps neither was he. But someday, when splitting wood alone in the cold was just a memory, and the cabin roof no longer leaked, and Henry no longer looked at the world with those two old eyes. For now, there was lumber to haul and fences to mend and winter to prepare for. It was enough. More than enough, it was a beginning. The wagon wheels creaked over the frozen ruts as Samuel guided his team toward the Morrison cabin. The bed was loaded with lumber, carefully selected pieces that would patch a roof and shore up walls. Hidden beneath, wrapped in an old horse blanket, were things he hadn't mentioned: a small saw, a hammer with a proper handle, nails enough for the job and then some. Grace was waiting in the dooryard, Henry beside her. She'd wound her hair up tight and wore men's work clothes, patched trousers, and a coat too large for her frame. The outfit should have looked comical, but there was dignity in her stance that made it seem natural as breathing. "Morning, Mrs. Morrison, Henry." Samuel climbed down from the wagon seat. "Good day for working." "Yes." She studied the lumber with a calculating eye. "That's more than we discussed." "Scrap pieces," Samuel said easily. "Been cluttering my barn. Figured we'd load what you need. Burn the rest." Her mouth tightened, but she didn't challenge the obvious lie. "Where do we start?" They worked through the morning, Samuel showing her how to measure and cut, how to fit boards to fill the gaps in the cabin walls. Grace learned quickly, her hands sure once she understood the task. Henry carried nails, sorted lumber by size, fetched water when they grew thirsty. The boy had a way of being helpful without getting underfoot, a skill learned too young. "You've done this before," Grace said, watching Samuel notch a board to fit around the cabin's corner. "Built my own place, years back. A man learns what he needs to." "And a woman." "A woman learns faster, usually has to." She gave him a sharp look, checking for mockery, but found none. They continued working, falling into a rhythm. Board, measure, cut, nail. The repetition was soothing, purposeful. By midday, they'd patched the worst gaps in the north wall. Samuel stepped back to survey their work. "That'll keep the wind out. Roof's next, but we'll need—" He stopped. Grace had gone very still, her head tilted, listening. Then Samuel herded 2 horses approaching through the trees, multiple horses moving without hurry. "Henry," Grace said quietly, "go inside." The boy obeyed instantly, disappearing through the cabin door. Grace's hand moved to the hammer at her belt. Samuel recognized the gesture. She'd reach for whatever weapon was handy, even if it was just a tool. 3 riders emerged from the tree line. Samuel knew them by sight: Jack Thornton from the Double Bar Ranch, his brother Pete, and a younger man Samuel didn't recognize. They were the kind of men who made their living moving other people's cattle, enforcing other people's will. Not outlaws exactly, but not far from it. "Well now," Jack said, reining up. His eyes moved from Samuel to Grace, lingering. "Heard someone was squatting in the old Mackenzie place. Came to have a look." "No one's squatting," Samuel said calmly. "Mrs. Morrison has an arrangement with the owner." "That so?" Jack's smile was unpleasant. "Funny, since I happen to know the owners in Chicago. Doubt he knows anything about any arrangement." Grace stepped forward. "We're not causing trouble, just need shelter through winter." "Pretty thing like you shouldn't be living rough." This from Pete, who had the kind of eyes that made women cross streets. "Town's got places for women in need, warm beds, steady work." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Samuel saw Grace's knuckles whiten around the hammer. "The lady's got shelter," Samuel said. His voice stayed level, but something in it made Pete's smile falter. And work, hauling lumber for me. Nothing else is your concern. Jack studied Samuel more carefully. Sam Hayes, isn't it hurt about your loss? Shame, that man gets lonely. Maybe isn't thinking clear. My thinking's clear enough. Is it? Jack leaned forward in his saddle. Because from where I sit, looks like you've got yourself mixed up in something. Woman shows up from nowhere, no husband in sight, moving into abandoned property. That's the kind of situation brings law attention, brings questions. Only questions I see are coming from you. The younger rider spoke up, eager to prove himself. Mr. Thornton's just looking out for the community. Strangers bring trouble. Some strangers, Samuel agreed, looking directly at the young man. Others bring nothing but a need for shelter and honest work. A wise man learns to tell the difference. Tension stretched tight. Samuel kept his hands visible but ready. He'd faced down men like these before, not gunfighters, but bullies who mistook solitude for weakness. The key was showing strength without inviting escalation. Grace broke the silence. I have papers. Everyone turned to look at her. Land lease, she continued. Signed and witnessed. My husband made the arrangement before he died. It was a lie, Samuel knew, but she sold it with such conviction that even Jack looked uncertain. Let's see these papers then, Pete demanded. They're in town, at the bank. Grace met his eyes steadily. Mister, Garrett has them in the safe. You're welcome to check. Samuel admired the bluff. Garrett was the bank manager, a stickler for rules who'd make these men wait and fill out forms and generally make their lives miserable if they tried to verify the story. By the time they discovered the truth, Grace could have actual papers drawn up or be long gone. Jack considered this, then shrugged. Maybe we'll do that. He looked at Samuel. You vouch for her? I do. Your word used to mean something in this county. Still does. Jack nodded slowly. All right then. But Hayes, a word of advice. Your neighbors are starting to talk. Man living alone as long as you have, suddenly taking interest in a young widow. It doesn't look right. I appreciate your concern, Samuel said dryly. I'll be sure to consider appearances. You do that. Jack wheeled his horse around. Come on, boys. We've wasted enough time. They rode off, but Pete looked back once, his eyes finding Grace in a way that promised this wasn't over. Samuel waited until the hoofbeats faded before speaking. They'll check your story. I know. Grace set down the hammer, her hands trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. I'll need to go to town, make arrangements. Garrett's a good man. Explain the situation. He might help. Tell him I sent you. She nodded, then looked at him fully. Why did you do that vouch for me? Because Jack Thornton's a snake who'd sell his mother for cattle money. And any enemy of his seems worth knowing. That's not an answer, Samuel considered. My wife used to say that kindness didn't need reasons, just opportunities. I'm starting to think she was right. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then, I should get Henry. He'll be worried. She moved toward the cabin, then stopped. Mr. Hayes, thank you. Just being neighborly. No, she said firmly. It was more than that, and we both know it. She went inside before he could respond. Samuel began cleaning up the tools, his mind working through implications. Word would spread now, it always did, by Sunday. Every churchgoer in the county would know Sam Hayes was helping the mysterious widow at the Mackenzie place. Some would approve, remembering their own hard times. Others would whisper about propriety and appearances and what exactly he expected in return. Let them talk. He'd lived through gossip before, survived worse than wagging tongues. What mattered was that roof getting fixed before the snow came. What mattered was a boy named Henry not freezing in a cabin with walls full of holes. Grace emerged with Henry close beside her. The boy's eyes were wide but calmer now, taking his cues from his mother's composure. We should finish the north wall, Grace said, picking up the hammer again. If you're still willing. I'm willing. They worked until dusk, not talking about the visit or what it meant, but something had shifted. The careful distance Grace maintained had narrowed. When Samuel showed Henry how to hold a board steady, she didn't object. When she struggled with a particularly stubborn piece of lumber, she accepted his help without stiffening. As darkness approached, Samuel loaded his tools. I'll come back day after tomorrow. We'll start on the roof if weather holds. We'll be ready. Grace hesitated, then added, I'll go to town tomorrow. See Mr. Garrett. Need company Thornton might. No. The word came quick and firm. I appreciate it, but no, some things I need to handle myself. Samuel understood. She'd accepted his help with the cabin because it could be framed as work, as trade. But this facing down threats, establishing her right to exist, this she needed to do alone. It was about more than pride. It was about proving, to herself as much as anyone, that she could stand on her own feet. Fair enough, but if you need anything, I know where to find you. He climbed onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. As he turned the team, Henry called out, Mr. Hayes, will you teach me more about building? Samuel looked at Grace, seeking permission. She gave a small nod. If your mother agrees, yes, a man should know how to work with his hands. The boy smiled, the first real smile Samuel had seen from him. It transformed his thin face, showing the child he might have been in easier times. Samuel drove home through the gathering dark, thinking about trust and the slow way it built, board by board, gesture by gesture. Grace Morrison would go to town tomorrow and face down whatever came. She'd create her story and make it true through sheer force of will. And he'd return in 2 days to work on the roof, maintaining the fiction that this was just business, just neighborly help, nothing more. But they both knew better, in vouching for her. In standing against men like Thornton, Samuel had crossed a line. He'd claimed her as part of his community, under his protection. It was an old code, older than law books or property deeds. It meant something out here where civilization was still more hope than fact. The stars were coming out by the time he reached home. Samuel tended his horses, ate a cold supper, and sat by the fire planning tomorrow's work. But his mind kept returning to that moment when Grace had said it was more than neighborly. She was right. He just wasn't sure what to call it yet. Trust, maybe, or the beginning of trust. That seemed enough for now. The first snow came early that year, dusting the ground like flour on a kitchen table. Samuel woke to its silence, the particular quiet that comes when the world wraps itself in white. He'd spent the previous week finishing the Morrison cabin roof, working alongside Grace in a rhythm they'd developed without words. Now, watching the snow fall, he wondered how they were faring. He had his answer by mid-morning when he spotted 2 figures trudging through the white toward his homestead. Grace and Henry, bundled in threadbare coats, the boy's feet wrapped in cloth and rope. Samuel met them at the porch. Long walk in this weather. The roof held, Grace said, which wasn't an answer to anything he'd asked, but told him what he needed to know. We came to work, as agreed. He looked at Henry, whose lips had a bluish tinge. Coffee's hot. Warm up first. Inside. Samuel stoked the fire higher while Grace and Henry huddled near the stove. The boy's eyes wandered the room, taking in details the books on the shelf, the wedding photograph Samuel hadn't been able to put away, the general orderliness of a house kept by habit rather than hope. This is nice, Henry said softly. Warm. Such a simple observation, yet it twisted something in Samuel's chest. He poured coffee for Grace, heated milk with molasses for the boy. Grace wrapped her hands around the cup like it was precious, closing her eyes as the steam rose to her face. You didn't have to come today, Samuel said. Not in this weather. Work is work. Weather doesn't change that. What needs doing? Grace asked. setting down her empty cup. Samuel had planned to mend harnesses, oil leather, the kind of indoor work that winter demanded. But looking at them, Grace trying not to show how the cold had bitten through her thin coat. Henry's feet barely thawed, he made a decision. Thought we might sort through some things in the storage room. Been meaning to clear it out. The storage room was where Martha's things lived now, boxed and waiting for a purpose Samuel hadn't been able to give them. Clothes, mostly. Blankets. Things that might fit a woman and child who needed them but wouldn't accept charity. Grace followed him down the narrow hallway, Henry trailing behind. The room smelled of cedar and lavender, Martha's sachets still doing their work. Samuel opened a trunk, keeping his voice steady. My wife's things. Been sitting here gathering dust. Seems wasteful. Grace touched a quilt, her fingers careful on the wedding ring pattern. These are beautiful. Martha was handy with a needle. The words came easier than expected. Always said beautiful things should be used, not stored away. I couldn't... Work bonus. Samuel interrupted. Been meaning to offer. Colds come early. Can't have my workers freezing. Grace looked at him, that sharp gaze that seemed to see through to the bone. Work bonus. That's right. She lifted out a wool dress, dark blue and sensible, held it against herself. It would need taking in. Martha had been broader through the shoulders, but it would fit. Your wife, Grace said carefully. Tell me about her. Samuel leaned against the doorframe. Martha Younger, before she married me, schoolteacher's daughter from Ohio. Came out here with her family when she was 17, full of ideas about civilizing the frontier. Did she, in her way, taught me to read better. For one thing, I could read before, but she made me want to read. He gestured at the trunk. Tried to teach anyone who'd sit still long enough. Had the neighbor children here twice a week, teaching letters and numbers. Henry had found a wooden box, opened it to reveal tin soldiers. He looked up at Samuel, questioning. Those were Thomas's. Samuel said, the name still hurt, but less sharply. He was too young to play with them proper, but he liked lining them up. May I? Henry asked. If your mother says so. Grace nodded, and Henry carefully lifted out a soldier, examining it with reverent attention. Samuel watched him, remembering smaller hands holding the same toy. How? Grace asked softly. The fever. Came through in 72, took half the county. Martha fought it for 2 weeks. Wouldn't rest, tending to everyone she could reach. Finally caught her, too. Thomas followed 3 days later. I'm sorry. So am I. Samuel straightened. But sorry doesn't change anything. Just have to keep going. They worked through the morning. Grace selecting practical items, clothes that could be altered. Blankets, a pair of boots that would fit Henry with room to grow. Samuel pretended to be occupied with other tasks, giving her dignity and accepting what they both knew was more than any work bonus. At noon, he prepared a simple meal: salt pork, beans, cornbread. They ate at his kitchen table, Henry careful with his manners despite his obvious hunger. The domesticity of it struck Samuel: 3 people sharing food. Snow falling outside, the kind of scene he'd thought lost to him forever. You mentioned your husband, Samuel said eventually. How long? 6 months, Grace replied. Lung fever. He was working the railroad, sending money back, until he couldn't. Railroad's hard work. He wasn't built for it. John was a clerk by trade, had fine handwriting, but clerks don't make enough to support a family, and the railroad paid cash money. Where from originally? Indiana, little town called Bloomfield. Nothing there after the war but debt and memory. Samuel understood. The war had left scars everywhere, visible and hidden both. Men came west running from those scars, hoping distance could heal what time couldn't. After the meal, they returned to sorting. Grace had relaxed slightly, allowing Henry to explore the house while they worked. The boy moved carefully, touching nothing without permission, but his curiosity was evident. "He's bright," Samuel observed, watching Henry study the books. "Too bright sometimes. Asks questions I can't answer. About his father? About everything. Why the sky changes colors. How birds know to fly south. Where we're going next. What do you tell him?" "The truth, when I know it. Stories, when I don't." She folded a blanket with precise movements. "He deserves better than this wandering." "Seems to me you're doing what you can." "What I can isn't enough." The words came fierce, bitter. "He should be in school, should have proper shoes and 3 meals certain every day, should have a father and a home and—" She stopped, pressing her lips tight. Samuel recognized the self-recrimination, the weight of falling short of your own expectations. "My father was a traveling preacher," he said. "Never had a home longer than 6 months. Never knew where next week's meal would come from. But he taught me to read from the Bible, to figure numbers from keeping his accounts. Taught me that home wasn't walls and a roof, but the people you built it with." Pretty words. True ones. Henry's got a mother who'd walk through snow to earn honest wages, who faces down men like Thornton without flinching. That's worth more than proper shoes. Grace turned away, but not before he saw the shine in her eyes. "We should go. Storm's likely to worsen." They bundled up their negotiated wages, clothes and blankets, and Henry's carefully chosen soldiers. Samuel added a sack of cornmeal and dried apples, ignoring Grace's sharp look. Work bonus, he'd say if challenged, but she didn't challenge. At the door, Henry tugged his mother's sleeve. "Mama, can we come back?" "When there's work," Grace said carefully. "There's always work," Samuel said. "Winter's long out here." Grace met his eyes. Something passed between them, unspoken but understood. Not quite trust yet, but the framework of it. The acknowledgement that they were building something, transaction by careful transaction. "Thursday," she suggested. "Thursday." They walked away through the falling snow, Henry clutching his soldiers, Grace carrying her bundles with dignified determination. Samuel watched until they disappeared into the white, then closed the door against the cold. The house felt different with their absence, not empty exactly, but waiting. He walked to the storage room, looked at the trunk they'd sorted through. Martha's wedding dress still lay folded at the bottom. He'd let Grace take the practical things, kept the memories for himself. But memories weren't enough anymore. They sustained, but didn't nourish, like trying to live on nothing but preserved food. What Grace and Henry brought was different possibility, perhaps the chance that life might be more than endurance. Samuel closed the trunk, went to tend his fire. Thursday, she'd said 3 days. He'd check the Mackenzie place tomorrow, make sure the roof truly had held, not interfering, just neighborly concern. He'd bring more firewood too. The oak they'd cut wouldn't last the winter. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the tracks Grace and Henry had left. By morning, there'd be no sign they'd been here at all, but the house would remember. The empty spaces had been filled, briefly, with voices and warmth and the careful negotiation of connection. Thursday couldn't come soon enough. That night, Samuel did something he hadn't done since Martha died. He made plans that extended beyond the next day's chores. Small plans fixing up the spare room, teaching Henry to whittle, showing Grace how to preserve meat for winter. Nothing grand or presumptuous, just the modest architecture of a life that might include others. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was, Samuel thought as sleep finally took him, exactly what Martha would have wanted. The riders came at dusk on a Tuesday, their horses dark against the snow. Samuel saw them from the barn where he was feeding the stock. Counted 5 men, maybe 6. They weren't hurrying, which made them more dangerous men bent on immediate violence, rode hard. These moved with the deliberate pace of those who believed their business was righteous. He recognized Jack Thornton's broad shoulders, Pete's slouch in the saddle. The others were hired muscle, the kind that drifted between ranches selling their guns and their absence of conscience. Samuel finished forking hay, moving naturally. giving no sign he'd noticed them. Then he walked to the house, checking the load in his Winchester as he moved. They stopped at his gate, spreading out in a half-circle, a tactical position that spoke of experience with this kind of visit. "Evening, Hayes," Jack called. "Need a word." Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle casual in his hands but ready. "Say it then." "Rather do this civilized. Mind if we come up?" "I mind. Say what you came to say from there." Jack's smile was thin. "Fair enough. That woman you've been helping, she's causing problems." "How so?" "Garrett at the bank says she's got no papers, no lease, no claim, nothing. Been telling lies." "Man's got a right to be mistaken about paperwork." "Not a mistake. She's squatting on property that ain't hers, and you've been helping her do it." Jack leaned forward in his saddle. "Now, we're reasonable men. She leaves quiet-like, no harm done, but she needs to go." "And if she doesn't?" Pete spoke up, his voice eager with implied threat. "Then we help her along. Shame if that cabin caught fire some cold night. Accidents happen." Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle. "That sounds like a threat against a woman and child." "Just observing how dangerous winter can be," Jack said smoothly, "especially for folks living where they shouldn't. I'll pass along your concern." "You do that, but Hayes—" Jack's pretense of friendliness dropped. "This is your one warning. We know you've been sweet on her, whole county's talking about it. But she's not Martha. She's not your concern. Stay clear when we come calling, or you'll share what happens." "That sounds like another threat." "It's advice from a neighbor. Take it." They wheeled their horses and left, their shadows long in the dying light. Samuel watched until they disappeared, then saddled Buttercup. Grace needed to know what was coming. The ride to the Morrison cabin seemed longer in the dark. Samuel pushed Buttercup as fast as he dared on the icy trail, his mind racing through options. The Thorntons wouldn't wait long, probably planning their visit for tomorrow night. Maybe the next. Men like that like to let fear build, but not so long their targets might prepare or flee. A light glowed in the cabin window, homey and vulnerable. Samuel dismounted, calling out before approaching, no sense startling Grace into shooting him. "It's Samuel Hayes." The door opened cautiously. Grace stood silhouetted against the firelight, Henry beside her. "Mr. Hayes, what's wrong?" "Thornton came by. We need to talk." She read his face, understanding immediately. "Henry, go finish your letters." "But Mama—" "Now, son." The boy retreated to the corner where a slate and chalk waited. Grace stepped aside, letting Samuel enter. The cabin had transformed in the weeks since she'd arrived, clean, ordered, with touches that made it a home. Curtains fashioned from flour sacks, wild flowers dried and hung from the rafters. Henry's soldiers arranged on a shelf Samuel had helped build. "How many?" Grace asked quietly. "6 today. Might be more when they come." "When?" "Tomorrow night, maybe after. They want you gone." Grace moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. "I knew this was coming. Hoped we'd have longer, but—" "You can't be here when they arrive." "Where would we go?" She turned to face him, anger flashing in her eyes. "It's December. I have a child. Where exactly should we run to?" "My place." The words hung between them. Grace stared at him, various emotions crossing her face. "That's not people would talk." "People are already talking. Let them—" "Better than—" He gestured at the cabin. "They threatened fire. Grace." "I know what men like that threaten." Her voice was bitter with experience. "Running to your house just confirms their stories about us. My spare room's made up. You and Henry would have privacy, just until we figure out something better." "There is no something better." Grace sank into a chair. "This is how it goes. They decide you don't belong, and you don't. We'll move on, find another abandoned place, until someone there decides we don't belong either." "No." She looked up at his flat tone. I said no. You're not running anymore. Neither is that boy. You don't get to decide. I'm not deciding. I'm offering. There's a difference. Samuel pulled out a chair, sat across from her. I've got 40 acres and a solid house. You've got skills I need: cooking, mending, help with the animals, proper employment, room and board included. Nothing improper about hiring help. No one would believe that. I don't care what anyone believes. Do you? Grace was quiet for a long moment. What about Henry Children notice things? He'd get attached. Maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing. She stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace. You don't know us. Don't know what you're offering to take on. I could be running from anything: the law, a husband who's not really dead, debts that would ruin you. Are you? No, but then I know enough. Samuel rose too. Grace, I've lived alone 3 years, talked to my horses more than people, eaten cold dinners because cooking for one seemed pointless. This place, my place, it's dying for want of life in it. You and Henry, you've brought something I'd forgotten existed. Maybe that's selfish of me, but I'm past caring about that too. Henry had abandoned his letters, watching them with those 2 wise eyes. Grace noticed, smoothing her expression. We're discussing business. Henry, finish your work. Yes, Mama. But he kept glancing over. Grace returned to her chair. If we accepted your offer, there'd need to be rules, clear boundaries. Whatever you need. I'd work for our keep. Real work, not make-believe. I won't be beholden. Agreed. And when spring comes, if we decide to move on, you won't try to stop us? That one hurt, but Samuel nodded. Your choice, always. I need to think. Not too long. Thornton won't wait. As if to underscore his words, a wolf howled somewhere in the darkness. Henry shivered, moving closer to his mother. Grace put her arm around him automatically, and in that gesture Samuel saw her decision being made. First light tomorrow, she said. We'll pack what matters. You'll need to bring the wagon. I'll be here before dawn. Samuel prepared to leave, but Grace called him back. Why? She asked. Really, why not the pretty reasons you give, but the real one? He considered lying, giving her the comfortable half-truths that made this easier, but she deserved better. Because I'm tired of being half alive, he said simply. Because when I see you and Henry, I remember what it felt like to have something to protect besides cattle. Because maybe I'm selfish enough to want that feeling back, even if it's not really mine. Grace's expression softened. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in years. It's the only truth I've got. She nodded slowly. Before dawn, then. Samuel rode home through the cold night, plans forming. He'd need to clear Martha's sewing room properly, make it suitable for Grace. The bed was still good. He'd checked that weeks ago, telling himself he was just being thorough. Extra blankets, lamp oil, whatever would help them feel settled rather than temporary. He'd face down Thornton too, when it came to that. The man was a bully, but not stupid. He'd think twice about moving against someone under Samuel's protection on Samuel's own land. There'd be talk, gossip, speculation about exactly what kind of arrangement this was. Let them talk. Words were just wind. At home, Samuel built up the fires, warming rooms that had been cold too long. He found himself humming some half-remembered tune Martha used to sing while cooking. The sound surprised him, this evidence of lightness returning. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Thornton wouldn't give up easily. The town gossips would have a festival of speculation. Grace herself might change her mind, might decide the cost of accepting help was too high. But tonight, Samuel Hayes prepared his home for guests, for life, for the possibility of something beyond mere survival. He'd forgotten what hope felt like, but here it was again, tentative as spring's first green shoots, but just as persistent. Before dawn, he'd return with the wagon. They'd load what mattered, not much, probably. Since people who'd learned to run traveled light, he'd bring them home, install them in rooms that needed filling. begin the delicate process of building trust into something stronger. You don't have to do that anymore. He'd told Grace when they first met, meaning the firewood. But he'd meant more than that. Even then, you don't have to run anymore. Don't have to face the winter alone. Don't have to carry every burden yourself. Maybe she heard those unspoken promises. Maybe that's why she'd said yes, despite the impropriety, despite the risk. Or maybe she was just tired too, ready to stop running even if stopping meant facing down men like Thornton. Either way, come dawn, Samuel wouldn't be riding alone anymore. That thought warmed him more than any fire. The blizzard struck 3 days after Grace and Henry moved into Samuel's house. It came howling out of the north like a living thing, turning the world white and wild. Samuel had seen the signs, the way the cattle bunched together, the peculiar heaviness in the air, and spent those 3 days preparing. Extra firewood stacked high, stock fed and watered, shutters secured. But storms like this laughed at preparation. By the second day, snow had drifted halfway up the door. The wind screamed around the corners of the house, seeking cracks and weaknesses. Inside, they maintained an island of warmth and light, the stove glowing red with constant feeding. Henry had taken fever the first night of the storm. Nothing serious, Grace said, but Samuel saw the worry she tried to hide. The boy lay on a pallet near the stove, flushed and restless, occasionally crying out in his sleep. Grace tended him with the efficiency of long practice. But as the storm worsened and Henry's fever climbed, her composure began to crack. "It's just the cold," she said, more to herself than Samuel. "He always takes cold easy. It'll break soon." But by the third morning, Henry's breathing had turned labored, rattling in his chest. Samuel knew that sound, had heard it in the weeks before Thomas died. He watched Grace bathe Henry's face with cool water, saw her hands tremble. "He needs willow bark tea," she said, "for the fever, and camphor for his chest." "I'll go." "Go!" She looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Go where?" "Town, doctor. Morrison keeps medicines." "In this," she gestured at the window, opaque with blown snow. "You can't even see the barn." "I know the way." "Samuel, no, it's 5 miles. You'd never make it." He was already pulling on his heavy coat, wrapping scarves around his face. "Done it before. Buttercup knows the route even blind." "This is different? This storm?" "This boy needs medicine." He met her eyes. "I'm going." Grace caught his arm. "If something happens to you." "Nothing will happen. I'll be back by nightfall." It was a lie, and they both knew it. In a storm like this, 5 miles might as well be 50, but Henry's breathing was getting worse, and Samuel had made a promise to himself, to Martha's memory, maybe to God that he wouldn't lose another child to sickness. Not if he could help it. He fought his way to the barn, the wind trying to tear him loose from the earth. Buttercup whinnied nervously as he saddled her, sensing his urgency. The other horses stamped and rolled their eyes at the storm's fury. "Easy, girl," Samuel murmured, his voice muffled by scarves. "Just you and me now. We've done hard things before." Leading Buttercup out into the storm was like stepping into a wall of white fury. The wind hit them broadside, nearly knocking Samuel off his feet. He mounted, trusting Buttercup's instincts more than his own sense of direction. The world had disappeared, no landmarks, no sky, no earth, just the howling white. They moved by faith and memory. Samuel knew there was a fence line for the first mile, then open country, then the creek that marked halfway. But knowing and finding were different things when you couldn't see past your horse's ears. Time lost meaning in the white. Could have been hours or minutes when Buttercup suddenly stopped, refusing to move forward. Samuel urged her on, but she planted her feet, and he'd learned to trust her warnings. Dismounting, he felt ahead with his hands and found the problem they'd wandered off course and nearly walked into a ravine. The detour cost them time and strength, but it could have cost much more. The cold was a living enemy. seeking every gap in his clothing. His feet went numb first, then his hands, despite the thick gloves. Ice formed on his scarves where his breath met the air. But he thought of Henry's labored breathing, of Grace trying to be strong while fear ate at her, and pushed on. Finally, impossibly, shapes emerged from the buildings of Willow Creek, ghosts in the storm. Samuel found Dr. Morrison's house by memory more than sight, pounding on the door until the doctor answered. "Sam Hayes. Good Lord, man, what are you doing out in this?" "Boy needs medicine. Fever and chest congestion." "Doctor—" Morrison didn't waste time on lectures about foolishness. He gathered willow bark, camphor, and a bottle of something he said would ease the breathing. "This for the widow's boy, heard you took them in." "Yes." "Proper thing to do." The doctor pressed an extra bottle into Samuel's hands. "Laudanum. Just a few drops if the pain gets too bad. How high's the fever?" "High. 3 days now." Morrison's face grew grave. "Get back quick as you can. Keep him warm but not too hot. Steam helps the breathing. Boil water near him. And Sam, if it turns to pneumonia—" "It won't." The journey back was worse. The wind had shifted, driving snow straight into their faces. Buttercup struggled, her strength flagging. Samuel dismounted and walked beside her, breaking trail, though his own legs felt like wood. The fence line that should guide them home had disappeared under drifts. Then Buttercup stopped again, but this time her head came up, ears pricked forward. She'd caught the scent of home, of the other horses, and found strength Samuel didn't know she still had. He trusted her completely now, letting her find the way while he simply held on. The barn materialized out of the white like a miracle. Samuel tended Buttercup first. She'd earned that and more, rubbing her down, giving her warm mash and extra oats. His own hands were too numb to work properly, but he managed. In the house, he found Grace where he'd left her, beside Henry. She looked up as he entered, and the relief in her eyes made every frozen mile worthwhile. Her gaze took in his ice-covered form, the way he moved stiffly, and something else crossed her face, something deeper than relief. "You fool," she whispered. "You wonderful fool." Samuel's frozen fingers could barely work the medicine bottles open. Grace took over, measuring doses with steady hands while he built up the fire and set water to boil for steam. They worked together without words, focused entirely on the child between them. The medicine helped. Within an hour, Henry's breathing eased slightly. The fever still burned, but not quite as fierce. Grace never left his side, bathing his face, coaxing water between his lips, murmuring the wordless comforts mothers know. Samuel made coffee, forced Grace to drink some. Made her eat too, though she protested. "You're no good to him if you collapse," he said, and she submitted. Through that long night, they kept vigil. The storm still raged, but it seemed distant now, less important than the small battlefield of Henry's palate. Samuel fed the fire, kept the water boiling, held things steady while Grace poured all her fierce love into willing her son well. Near dawn, Henry's fever broke. The sudden sweat, the easier breathing, the way his face relaxed, all the signs were there. Grace wept then, silently, her shoulders shaking with released tension. Without thinking, Samuel put his hand on her shoulder. Without hesitation, she gripped it, holding on like he was the only solid thing in the world. "Thank you," she whispered. "He's a fighter, like his mother. I meant for going, for risking—" She couldn't finish. "It's what anyone would do." "No." She turned to look at him, eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "It's what you did. There's a difference." Henry slept then. Real sleep, not the restless tossing of fever. Grace finally consented to rest too, curled in the chair beside him. Samuel covered her with a blanket, then sat keeping watch over them both. The storm broke that afternoon, as sudden as it had come. Sun emerged, turning the white world to diamond brilliance. Samuel went out to check the stock. Wading through drifts, chest high. All had survived, though they'd need extra feed to recover. When he returned to the house, he found Grace making soup, Henry propped up with pillows, weak but alert. "Mr. Hayes went through the storm," Henry said, his voice small but wondering. "Mama said he brought medicine." "Just a ride to town," Samuel said. "Through the blizzard." Buttercup did most of the work. Henry studied him with those two old eyes. "You could have died." "But I didn't." "Why?" The simple question children ask that adults never would. Samuel glanced at Grace, who was watching him intently. "Because you needed help. That's what people do, help each other." "Is that why we live here now, to help each other?" "Yes," Grace said quietly. "That's exactly why." Later, after Henry had eaten and slept again, Grace found Samuel in the barn. He was checking Buttercup's legs for strain, the loyal mare having earned a lifetime of gentle care. "I need to say something," Grace began. "No need." "There is," she took a breath. "When John died, I swore I'd never depend on anyone again. Never put Henry and myself in a position where someone else's choices mattered. It seemed safer, being alone. And now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe depending on the right person isn't weakness." She paused. "You could have died today. For my son. For us. Anyone would—" "Stop saying that." Her voice was sharp. "Own what you did. You rode into death for a boy who's nothing to you but an obligation you took on. That means something. Let it mean something." They stood there in the barn's quiet warmth, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of animals feeding. Outside, the sun was setting, turning the snow pink and gold. A new world after the storm, clean and bright with possibility. "It means something," Samuel said finally. Grace nodded, satisfied. "Spring's a long way off," she said, referring to their agreement. "It is. A lot can happen before spring." "It can." She almost smiled. "Just so we understand each other." As she walked back to the house, Samuel realized they did understand each other. The storm had torn away pretense, leaving something raw and real. Trust, maybe, or the beginning of something more. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the world overnight. The snow melted in rushing streams, revealing green shoots that had waited patiently beneath the white. The air smelled of wet earth and possibility, and even the cattle seemed to step lighter as they grazed on the new grass. Samuel stood at the fence he and Henry had mended together, watching Grace work in the garden plot they'd prepared. She moved with confidence now, no longer the wary stranger who'd stood in the Mackenzie cabin doorway months ago. The sun had brought color back to her cheeks, and she'd taken to humming while she worked small tunes that drifted across the yard like birdsong. "She's planting too early," Henry observed, coming to stand beside him. The boy had shot up 2 inches over the winter, though he was still small for his age. Frost could still come. "Your mother knows about late frost," Samuel said. "See how she's only putting in the hardy vegetables, cabbage, turnips, onions? They can take a bit of cold." Henry nodded seriously. Over the months, he'd become Samuel's shadow, absorbing knowledge about animals and weather, tools and seasons. He learned the way children do when survival depends on it quickly, thoroughly, without forgetting. "Will you teach me to ride proper this summer?" Henry asked. "Mama says I'm old enough now." "If she says so, then we'll start tomorrow." The boy's face lit up, really on Buttercup. "She's gentle enough for learning, though she's got opinions, so you'll need to listen to her." "I'm good at listening," Henry said, then paused. "Mr. Hayes, are we staying past spring?" It was April now, well past the time Grace had reserved the right to leave, but she hadn't mentioned it, and Samuel hadn't asked. They'd fallen into rhythms, morning chores done together, meals shared. Evenings by the fire with Samuel teaching Henry his letters while Grace mended or knitted. It felt permanent. But feelings and facts were different things. "That's for your mother to decide," Samuel said carefully. "But you want us to stay." The directness of children. Samuel looked down at the boy who'd somehow become essential to his days. "Yes, I want you to stay." "Good. I want to stay too." Henry kicked at a fence post, testing its sturdiness like Samuel had taught him. "Mama's happy here. She sings now. She didn't sing before." They watched Grace work for a while longer, then headed to the barn to prepare for the next day's plowing. The fields needed turning, and Samuel had been putting it off, knowing it was too much for one man, but reluctant to hire help. The gossips in town had finally tired of discussing the widow Morrison living at the Hayes place, but bringing in strange men would start the tongues wagging again. At supper, Grace brought it up herself. "You need help with the plowing." "I'll manage." "No, you won't. 40 acres is too much for one man, and you know it." She passed him the biscuits, her movements easy and familiar. "The Svensson boys are looking for work. They're good men, and they keep their mouths shut." "You've been asking around." "I've been listening. There's a difference." She smiled slightly. "Mrs. Garrett at the bank says they helped her cousin last season. Worked hard, no trouble." Samuel considered. The Svensson brothers were recent arrivals, Swedish immigrants who kept to themselves, less likely to gossip, more interested in earning money than speculation. "All right, I'll ride over tomorrow. See if they're interested." "Good." Grace stood to clear the table, but Samuel noticed her pause. Hand pressed to her back. "You've been working too hard in that garden?" "Work never killed anyone." "Stubborn pride might—" She gave him a look that had become familiar, part exasperation, part fondness. "I'm fine, though—" She hesitated. "There's something I need to tell you, about why we left Indiana." Samuel waited. In all these months, Grace had shared little about her past beyond the basic facts. He hadn't pushed, respecting her privacy as she respected his. Grace sat back down, folding her hands on the table. "John, my husband, he had debts, gambling debts, though I didn't know until after he died. Men came looking for payment. They said I could work it off. But the work they meant—" She stopped, gathering herself. "I took Henry and ran, changed our name. It was Hartley before. I doubt they're still looking. But I thought you should know. In case they find you here." "Yes." Samuel reached across the table, covering her hands with his. "Then they'll find more than they bargained for. You can't fight my battles." "I'm not, but this is my land, my home. Anyone threatens you here, they threaten me. That's not fighting your battle, that's defending what's mine." Grace turned her hands palm up, gripping his. "Is that what we are yours?" The question hung between them, weighted with months of careful distance and growing closeness. Samuel thought of all the ways he could answer, all the words that might capture what they'd built. But words had never been his strength. "If you'll have me," he said simply, "both of you." Grace's eyes filled, but she was smiling. "Samuel Hayes, is that a proposal?" "It's whatever you need it to be. Proposal, promise, partnership. I'm not good with pretty speeches, Grace, but I know I wake up looking forward to the day because you're in it. I know Henry feels like the son I thought I'd lost forever. I know this house is alive again, and I don't want to go back to the way it was before." "I don't need pretty speeches." Grace squeezed his hands tighter. "But I need to know, is this about loneliness, about replacing what you lost?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "Martha and Thomas will always be part of me, but you're not a replacement. Grace, you're not a second choice or a substitute. You're the woman who faced down winter with nothing but determination, who raised a fine boy against all odds, who brought music back to this house. I don't love you because I lost them. I love you because of who you are." The word hung in the air, love. Neither had said it before, though it had lived unspoken in every shared meal. every evening by the fire, every small kindness traded back and forth. "Well," Grace said softly, "when you put it that way." Henry chose that moment to burst through the door. "There's a rider coming, moving fast!" Samuel rose, instinctively reaching for the rifle by the door. But as the rider drew closer, he relaxed. It was young Tom Peterson from town, riding like his life depended on it. "Mr. Hayes," the boy called, sliding from his lathered horse. "Doc Morrison sent me. Says to tell everyone there's fever in town. The bad kind. He says folks should stay on their farms. Avoid coming in unless desperate." "How bad?" Grace asked, coming to stand beside Samuel. "3 dead already. Dozen more sick. Doc says it's like what came through in '72. Samuel felt Grace's hand find his, both remembering their own losses to fever. "Tell Doc we'll stay clear. And Tom, wash your hands good before you eat or touch your face. The doc say what kind of fever?" "Scarlet fever. He thinks maybe typhoid. Says to boil water for drinking. Keep sick folks separate." After the boy left to warn other farms, they stood together in the dooryard, watching as dust settle. The specter of disease hung over every frontier community, a reminder of how fragile their small victories were. "We'll be careful," Grace said. "Keep Henry close. Boil the water like the doctor said." "We have what we need here," Samuel agreed. "No reason to risk town." They went inside together. Henry peppered them with questions about fever and why they had to stay home. Grace answered patiently while Samuel secured the house, a ritual that had become automatic checking windows, barring doors, making their small fortress ready for another siege. Later, after Henry was asleep, Samuel and Grace sat on the porch watching stars emerge. The spring night was soft around them, full of the sounds of growing things and settling animals. "You never answered," Samuel said eventually. "About staying." Grace leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable even a month ago. "I thought I had, yes, Samuel, to all of it. The staying, the partnership, the proposal. Yes." "Good." He put his arm around her, drawing her closer. "Should we tell Henry?" "He already knows. That boy sees everything." She was quiet for a moment. "We should marry soon, before the fever passes and folks start visiting again. I don't want there to be talk." "Let them talk." "No." Her voice was firm. "We do this right. For Henry, for the memory of those we lost, for ourselves. We've both had enough of just surviving. Samuel, time to try living instead." She was right, as she often was. They'd built something worth protecting here, worth making official in the eyes of God and law. Not out of fear of gossip, but out of respect for what they'd found, this unexpected second chance at family. "I'll ride to the next county tomorrow," Samuel said. "Find a preacher who'll come out. Can't risk town with a fever." "And I'll finish that garden? We'll need vegetables come summer, especially if we can't trade in town for a while." They sat planning quietly, their words weaving a future neither had dared imagine months ago. The spring darkness was full of promise seeds in the ground, crops to tend, a boy to raise, a life to build together. When they finally went inside, Samuel paused at Martha's portrait. For the first time, he felt no guilt, only gratitude. She would have approved, he thought, would have liked Grace's strength and Henry's curiosity, would have wanted this life continuing, love finding a way. "Thank you," he whispered to the portrait, then followed Grace inside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges finding a preacher, keeping Henry entertained while confined to the farm, starting the spring plowing, but tonight, with Grace humming in the kitchen and Henry safe in his bed, Samuel Hayes was content. The winter was over, in more ways than one. Spring had come to the land and to his heart, bringing with it the promise of harvest. The hill overlooked the whole valley, a gentle rise where the grass grew thick and wildflowers bloomed in profusion. Samuel led the way. Grace and Henry following the narrow path he'd worn over years of visits. At the crest stood two simple headstones, weathered but well-tended, surrounded by a fence he'd built to keep the cattle from trampling the ground. Martha Hayes, beloved wife, read one stone. Thomas Hayes, our angel, read the smaller one beside it. Grace stood quietly, her hand finding Henry's shoulder as they gave Samuel a moment with his ghosts. "Grace," Samuel said finally, his voice steady, "I'd like you to meet my first family. Martha, Thomas, this is Grace Morrison and her boy Henry. They've brought life back to our home." Henry stepped forward, placing a handful of wildflowers he'd gathered on each grave. The gesture was unprompted, purely from his generous heart, and Samuel felt his throat tighten. "Mama says they're in heaven," Henry said solemnly, "watching over you." "I believe that's true," Samuel replied. Grace moved to stand beside him. "They raised a good man. I'm grateful for that." They stood in comfortable silence, the spring breeze carrying the scent of new grass and possibility. Below them, the farm spread out, the house with smoke rising from the chimney, the barn and corrals, the freshly plowed fields ready for planting. It looked prosperous, alive, like a place where families grew and thrived. "I come here when I need to think," Samuel said, "or when I need to remember, less often now than before. Because the remembering hurts less, because there's more to think about than just the past." Grace slipped her hand into his. 2 weeks had passed since their wedding, a simple ceremony with the traveling preacher, the Svensson brothers as witnesses, and Henry holding the rings with trembling excitement. She wore Martha's wedding band now, resized to fit, with Samuel's blessing. Not as a replacement, but as a continuation, a love passed forward like an inheritance. "Tell me about her," Grace said. "Not the sad parts, the everyday parts." Samuel smiled. "She couldn't cook worth a damn when we first married. Burned everything. I ate charcoal biscuits for 6 months before she got the hang of the stove." "You never said anything. She was so proud of those biscuits. How could I?" He squeezed her hand. "She learned, though. Got to where she could make a feast from nothing but flour and lard and whatever grew wild. And Thomas, curious about everything, like Henry, always asking why. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly south? Why can't horses climb trees?" Samuel chuckled at the memory. "I'd make up answers when I didn't know. Martha would scold me for filling his head with nonsense." "Mr. Hayes." Henry had wandered a little ways off, examining the fence. "Did you build this yourself?" "I did. Your ma helped me fix the section that fell in the winter storm." "Could you teach me to build things proper?" "Already am, aren't I?" The boy nodded, satisfied, and went back to exploring. Grace watched him with the soft expression that transformed her face whenever she looked at her son. "He's thriving here," she said, "growing like a weed, learning everything you teach him. I worried he'd forgotten how to be a child. But look at him." It was true. The haunted look had faded from Henry's eyes, replaced by the normal curiosity and energy of a 7-year-old boy. He'd taken to farm life like he'd been born to it, finding joy in simple things, gathering eggs, feeding chickens, riding Buttercup around the corral. "We're all thriving," Samuel observed. They made their way back down the hill, Henry running ahead to check on a rabbit's nest he'd discovered the day before. The house came into view, and Samuel still felt that small lift of pleasure seeing smoke from the chimney, knowing Grace was keeping the home fires burning. "I've been thinking," Grace said as they walked, "about what you said the day you found us. You don't have to do that anymore. About gathering firewood. About more than that. I think, even then, you saw what we needed. Not just wood for warmth, but—" She paused, searching for words. Permission to stop running, to stop just surviving. "You gave me the same thing," Samuel pointed out. "I was just going through motions before you came, existing, not living." They reached the house as the sun was setting. painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Henry was already inside, chattering about the baby rabbits he'd counted. Grace went to start supper while Samuel tended the evening chores, but the peace of routine was broken by the sound of approaching horses. 2 riders appeared on the road, not racing, but moving with purpose. Samuel recognized Dr. Morrison and the sheriff, Walter Banks. His hand didn't go to his gun, but he positioned himself between the door and the visitors. "Evening, Sam," the sheriff called out. "Ma'am, not trouble, just news." They dismounted, and Samuel noticed both men looked trail-worn. "Coffee's on," he offered, and they accepted gratefully. Inside, Grace served coffee while the men gathered their thoughts. Henry sat quietly in the corner, instinctively knowing when adult business was being discussed. "The fever's passed," Dr. Morrison said first. "No new cases in a week. Lost 5 souls total, but it could have been worse." "God rest them," Grace murmured. "There's more." Sheriff Banks said, "Had some men through town yesterday, from Indiana, looking for a woman and boy. Said they had legal business with a Mrs. John Hartley." Grace went very still. Samuel moved to stand behind her chair, a quiet show of support. "Did they say what kind of legal business?" he asked. "Debts, they claimed. Said the woman's husband died owing money, and they had papers saying the debt passed to her." Banks sipped his coffee. "Thing is, I never heard of any Mrs. Hartley in these parts. We got a Mrs. Hayes, recently married. Got a Morrison widow who stayed a spell at the old Mackenzie place, but she settled up and moved on months ago." The sheriff's meaning was clear. Grace looked up at him. "I've never heard of any Mrs. Hartley either." "Didn't think so." Banks stood. "I told those men as much. Suggested they'd wasted a long journey. They weren't happy, but they left. Doubt they'll be back, lot of expense for what they admitted was a small debt." "If they do come back," Samuel asked. "Well, a man's got a right to defend his property and family from trespassers. Kansas law's real clear on that." Banks put on his hat. "Just thought you should know. In case." After they left, Grace sat trembling. "They found me, even out here, even with the name change. And it didn't matter." Samuel interrupted. "You're not Grace Hartley. You're Grace Hayes. Those debts, whatever they were, belong to a woman who doesn't exist anymore." "It's not that simple." "It is exactly that simple." He knelt beside her chair. "You're my wife. This is our home. Anyone wants to challenge that. They go through me, through Sheriff Banks, through every neighbor who's seen what we've built here. You're not alone anymore. Grace, neither of you." Henry had crept closer during the conversation. Now he wrapped his arms around his mother. "We're staying, aren't we? This is home now." Grace pulled him close, looking over his head at Samuel. "Yes," she said firmly. "This is home." Later, after Henry was asleep and the house was quiet, Samuel and Grace sat on the porch as was their custom. The stars were brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called. "No more looking over your shoulder." Samuel said, "That's done now." "It's strange," Grace mused. "I ran so far, so long, and what I was running from seems small now. Those men, those debts, they have no power here." "Different world out here. What matters in Indiana doesn't mean much when you're fighting blizzards and building from scratch." Grace leaned into him. "I used to think I was running to something, not just from something. Now I know what it was." "What's that?" "This, you. A place where Henry could grow up strong and unafraid, where the past is just stories we tell, not chains that bind us." They sat in peaceful silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. In the barn, horses stirred and settled. From the house came the tick of the clock Martha had loved, still keeping time for a new family. "I want more children," Grace said suddenly. "Brothers or sisters for Henry. Would that be all right?" Samuel pulled her closer. "More than all right. This house was built for a big family. About time it had one. Martha wouldn't mind. Martha would be first in line to knit baby blankets. She had plans for 6 children. Did I ever tell you that used to say she wanted enough for a proper harvest crew? Grace laughed, the sound bright in the darkness. 6 might be ambitious. We'll take what comes, Samuel said, whatever blessings we're given, as if in response to talk of blessings. A shooting star blazed across the sky. Henry would have insisted on making a wish, but Samuel found he had none to make. Everything he wanted was hear a woman who'd become his partner and love, a boy who called him Pa now, a home filled with purpose and promise. The ghosts were quiet, the past reconciled with the present. Tomorrow would bring work, always work on a farm, but also laughter, shared meals, small moments of connection that built a life worth living. Spring had given way to early summer, and the crops were growing strong. Samuel stood, offering Grace his hand. Come on, Mrs. Hayes. Early morning tomorrow. Every morning's early with you, Mr. Hayes, she replied, but took his hand gladly. They went inside together, checking on Henry, a nightly ritual before retiring. The boy slept deeply. One arm flung out, the other curled around the wooden horse Samuel had carved for him. In the moonlight, he looked younger than his years, finally free to be just a child. In their room, Grace paused by the window. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For seeing us that day in the woods, for saying those words, for meaning them. She turned to face him. You don't have to do that anymore. Gather firewood alone, carry burdens by yourself, face winter without warmth. Neither of us do. Samuel crossed to her, framing her face with his work-worn hands. I love you, Grace Hayes. And I love you, Samuel Hayes. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of growing things and the promise of harvest. The house stood strong against the darkness, no longer a monument to loss, but a beacon of renewal. In the barn, Buttercup dozed, probably dreaming of the boy who'd learned to ride her with gentle hands. On the hill, 2 graves kept their quiet vigil, but even there, wildflowers bloomed, life persisted, love found a way, and in a house that had known too much silence, laughter lived again. Thank you for listening to this story of love and resilience in the American frontier. I hope Samuel and Grace's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while telling it. Where are you listening from today? Please comment below and let us know. It's wonderful to connect with listeners from all around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier stories. And share your thoughts about Samuel and Grace's story in the comments. Did their journey remind you of the courage it takes to trust again? Let's discuss.